Cheers, everyone. Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. So, U.S. foreign policy. What is really just mind-boggling about U.S. foreign policy is that we will do something. We'll have a narrative for why we're doing something, when in reality, it's really several other different reasons. And sometimes it's hard to figure out what the exact true motivation is. We look at this Ukraine crisis, for example, this Ukraine proxy war. We say we're there to help Ukraine defend its democracy, despite the fact that the opposition party was banned. The opposition candidate that might challenge Zelensky was jailed, and the elections have been indefinitely delayed. So we're defending the Ukrainian democracy despite the fact that there is no democracy in Ukraine. And we've also been told that we're there supporting them because we are trying to degrade the Russian military and economy to take down a geopolitical enemy. So there's multiple reasons why we're there. And again, it's not quite clear which is the real reason, although I will say with the Ukraine, it's more the second one. We're trying to hurt Russia, and the whole thing about democracy and defending democracy is just BS. And then we could look at Iraq, for example, Operation Iraqi Freedom. We were there to free the Iraqis from a madman who had weapons of mass destruction, except he didn't. And we really just destroyed that country for years. That war ended up killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and costing the United States untold amounts of money. So why were we really there? Was it oil? Was it pipelines? Was it to protect the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency? Maybe all of that. But again, the stated reasons and all these other reasons there probably make more sense. It's hard, again, to figure out the exact reason why we're doing something, although we can sort of conclude it wasn't a noble effort, right? And then you have Afghanistan. We invaded Afghanistan in 2001 because this was the base of operations for Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, and we occupied that country for, I guess, over about 20 years. And the irony is that we ended up killing, ostensibly, that's what we're told, killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, not Afghanistan, in Pakistan. And according to Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, the Pakistani military knew he was there. So why aren't we invading Pakistan? Why 10 years later were we still in Afghanistan? Again, these mysteries. Now, one thing that's interesting about Afghanistan, the Taliban, is this issue about poppy growth. Because back in 2000, a year before he invaded, the Taliban actually banned the growth of poppy. So I have an article here. This is October 29, 2000. Taliban chief warns opium growers in northern Afghanistan. Chief of the ruling Taliban militia, Mullah Muhammad Omar, Sunday warned farmers in the opposition-controlled parts of northern Afghanistan that they would be punished if they cultivate the opium poppy. If the troops from the Islamic Army of Taliban capture the areas under the opposition and find poppy cultivation, they will destroy the fields and punish the farmers, Omar said in a statement from his southern Kandahar base. Omar called upon farmers in the opposition-held districts to abide by his decree. His spokesman, Abdul Hay Mutmayan, told AFP. The reclusive Taliban chief last month announced a total ban on opium cultivation throughout the war-torn country, saying violators would be punished. Omar did not specify the penalty. Afghanistan last year emerged as the world's largest opium producer with a record yield of 4,600 tons. So 2000, the Taliban bans opium in Afghanistan, the growing of opium. And this was recognized by the UN in a paper from the UN. It says here on July 27, 2000, the Taliban supreme leader issued a decree imposing for the first time a total ban on opium poppy cultivation in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And the UN here also was questioning whether or not this ban would be effective when it says, however, the Taliban's effort to translate the decree into a measurable reduction of opium poppy cultivation will need to be closely monitored as from this year's poppy planting season. Well, was it in fact successful? Here's an article, TNI. The Taliban opium ban in 2000-2001 had, there is no doubt, the most profound impact on opium heroin supply in modern history. Exogenous global causes can indeed be eliminated as explanations. It was a rare historical moment that allowed almost absolute compliance in the south of the country with hardly any direct enforcement or punishment required. From the eastern regions where Taliban control was far from absolute, several cases of disobedience were reported, largely resolved by means of negotiations and payoffs to the local warlords. By harvest time in spring 2001, the effectiveness of the ban was already confirmed beyond any doubt and astonished the international community at the time. So apparently the Taliban said no more opium, and it was pretty much followed. They shut it down big time. But, as you know, something changed, and that, of course, is the invasion of Afghanistan in 2011 by the United States, and this completely changed everything. In 2001, the production was 185 metric tons, but by 2002, it was over 3,400 tons. So it completely rebounded after the United States invaded Afghanistan. But at the time, it was praised as a good thing by the UN, saying, "Okay, this is good. They're fighting the poppy opium growth here, or the opium there." But now the United States invades, and boom, it's all back up. So why did the poppy growth return? Who was to blame here? Well, 2007 NBC article saying it was the Taliban that reversed the policy and started to allow the growth again. It says the Taliban cashes in on drug trade it once banned. When the Taliban ordered Afghanistan's fields cleared of opium poppies 7 years ago because of Islam's ban on drugs, fearful farmers complied en masse. Today, officials say the militia nets tens of millions by forcing farmers to plant poppies and taxing the harvest. Now, it is going on to say that the reason they did this was because the Taliban was using the profits from selling the poppies to finance the war against the United States. So you would think that if they were doing that, the United States would want to stop this from happening and burn down those fields. But apparently, when the United States entered the war or started the war in 2001, it was the U.S. policy to not do anything about the poppies. Article here. Between 2001 and 2004, the U.S. very much had a hands-off policy towards the opium poppy, partially because Northern Alliance warlords, who the U.S. was using for intelligence and for direct military operations against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, were knee-high in opium poppy. So the U.S. said the priorities are to defeat the Taliban, not their human rights problems or that they are peddling in the drug trade. That changed in 2004 when the United States, thinking that the Taliban had been defeated, now expanded the menu of our objectives. Now we want to suppress the drug trade. So from about 2004 to 2008, the U.S. government has been pushing towards greater and greater eradication. The Afghan government wasn't necessarily keen to do it. Now, here's what I find funny. So we're first saying that the Taliban is using the drugs to fund the war against the United States, but we're also saying here that the United States had a policy of we're not going to touch it. So does this not go in contradiction to one another? Wouldn't the United States want to knock down these fields, and for the warlords that were helping us, perhaps give them some money? So, okay, we're going to knock down your fields, but here's X amount of money, and God knows we were sending a lot of money over there. That should not have been the issue. So why did the United States let these poppy fields continue to grow? But then it says from 2004 to 2008, the U.S. was pushing for greater eradication. But if you look at the actual a chart of how much Afghanistan was making, there was no real reduction. 2007 and 2008 were some of their biggest years for the poppies. So we weren't really doing that. And then there's an article from New York Times, 2010. U.S. turns a blind eye to opium in Afghan town. The effort to win over Afghans on former Taliban turf in Marja has put American and NATO commanders in the unusual position of arguing against opium eradication, pitting them against some Afghan officials who are pushing to destroy the harvest. So now it's the U.S. is turning a blind eye, and it's Afghan officials who are trying to destroy the harvest. I'm trying to figure out who's doing what here. A lot of different narratives again running around, and which one is the true one? The article continues saying, from General Stanley A. McChrystal on down, the military's position is clear. U.S. forces no longer eradicate, as one NATO official put it. Opium is the main livelihood of 60 to 70% of the farmers in Marja, which was seized from Taliban rebels in a major offensive last month. American Marines occupying the area are under orders to leave the farmers' fields alone. So it's we no longer eradicate, despite the fact that I show you the numbers here. We weren't really doing that because the numbers weren't really changing. So what the hell is going on here? It's hard to figure out. So now let's fast forward 2022, 2023. Article: How the Taliban launched the most successful counter-narcotics effort in human history. What? So once again, the Taliban has knocked out the narcotics. Like that in 2023. But here's the funny part. When you go on to read this article, they're actually arguing that this is actually a bad thing for the world. It says here, America's war on drugs, launched by President Richard Nixon in 1971, raged for more than half a century, but hardly put a dent in the Afghan opium trade. The country's farmers account for more than 80% of the world's opium production, but even the American invasion in 2001 did little to disrupt the flow of drugs out the nation. Well, we know why, because apparently after we invaded, it came back, and the Taliban had already shut it down. But now, where the world's drug enforcement community has failed, the Taliban themselves are succeeding. In April last year, the group's religious leader issued an edict prohibiting poppy farming across Afghanistan. More than 12 months on, the ban is being described by experts as the most successful counter-narcotics effort in human history. Now, here's the part where it talks about this could actually be bad. Now, experts are warning of profound and unpredictable consequences if the ban on poppy production holds, consequences that will reach far beyond Afghanistan's borders. Opiate production in countries like Myanmar and Mexico could boom to fill the void created by the Taliban, with all sorts of attendant impacts on trafficking routes, gangs, and supply chains. Meanwhile, Afghan farmers and others who rely on the poppy trade could be driven to leave the country, further undermining the domestic economy and exacerbating irregular migration pressures on large parts of Europe, Asia, and America. It is also possible that the gap left by the collapse of the world's largest opium market could be filled by fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, substances that through overdose are killing more young and middle-aged Americans than cancer, heart disease, or guns. I think the concern will be if heroin supplies diminish significantly, and we won't get a flavor of that until next year, a lot of fentanyl will come into the system. And if there was a lot of fentanyl or similar in the system, then the likely outcome of that is more deaths rather than a longer cycle of addiction. People don't get addicted to heroin after a few days, but after your first hit of fentanyl could be your last. So, the Taliban gets rid of the poppies, and we're actually worried that it's going to be worse for the world. And there's so many articles actually saying this. The Taliban's successful opium ban is bad for Afghans in the world. This ban is not a counter-narcotics victory and will have negative economic and humanitarian consequences, potentially leading to a refugee crisis. So, what's going on here? The Taliban seems to be the only place besides, I guess, Singapore, who can successfully ban a drug and get rid of it. And the minute they do that, everybody in the West freaks out and says, this is actually going to be bad for the world. It's going to cause more use of fentanyl and more overdose, and then it's going to go to Mexico. So my question is, if the Taliban can stop this, why is the United States government, that has a yearly budget of $4 trillion plus, why can't they stop the drug problem? Why can't they shore up the border with Mexico and actually prevent these drugs from coming in our country? And again, what is really going on here? What are we really trying to do with drugs? Are we actually trying to stop it despite our 50, 60-year war against drugs? We just legalized marijuana in the United States and many states. There's dispensaries popping up. So it's perplexing to me to see this narrative that drugs, poppies, are actually good, not bad, if they're allowed to exist, and that the Taliban, by destroying them, is actually causing more problems. So we're going to have to keep an eye on this and see if these dire predictions that banning poppies or having less poppies is going to lead to all these negative consequences other places in the world, and an increase in overdoses and drug addiction. Be very curious to see this. And maybe the real problem here is not what the Taliban are doing. Again, maybe the real problem here is the fact that our U.S. government and our system isn't capable or doesn't want to properly end the drug issue. And that's what I think is the real thing going on here. We don't want to see an end to drugs. We don't. And the U.S. is perfectly capable of stopping it if we wanted to. But we don't. And we allow, as this border with Mexico, to be chaotic for the last several decades with paramilitary organizations controlling it. And they do the most heinous things to people to punish people who go against them. The cartels in Mexico make ISIS look like choir boys. Yet the United States government apparently is incapable or doesn't want to actually go after them and shut the border down and stop these drugs from coming in. There's something else going on here. It's not clear, but I know this, it's not good. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe. and I'll see you next time.